Everyone knows the story. A poor boy trades his cow for a handful of beans, climbs a sky-piercing stalk, and finds a giant's castle in the clouds. But what if that children's tale, passed down in nurseries and picture books, carries memories older than writing itself? Recent folklore research suggests that the bones of Jack and the Beanstalk may reach back nearly 5,000 years, to a time when people first imagined a living bridge between earth and heaven. Behind Jack's reckless ascent lies something far older than magic beans, a vision of the world itself, stretching from soil to sky. And to understand where that vision began, we have to dig far beneath the roots of the story. No one person invented the story we now call Jack and the Beanstalk. It grew the way real vines do, from older roots that already lay in the ground, wrapping itself around ideas that were there long before anyone thought to write them down. To see where those roots begin, you have to step back to a time when people mapped the world with stories, because there were few other maps to use. Long before castles in the clouds, farmers and herders in the lands we now call Eurasia imagined a living bridge that linked the soil under their feet to a powerful realm above. They also told of beings larger than life who guarded treasure and blocked that bridge. Those two elements, a vertical passage to the sky and a dangerous keeper of wealth, are the oldest parts of the pattern that later became Jack's climb. Across early Indo-European cultures, from the northern forests to the steppe, people told of a world tree or a sky pillar. It could be a colossal oak, a birch, or a mountain that pierced the heavens. In the north, later poets would call it Yggdrasil, the ash whose branches hold the sky. In other regions, the image took other names, but the function stayed the same. The tree was a spine for the world, connecting earth, sky, and often an underworld. Why did this image matter so much? Because life depended on reading the sky. Early farmers and herders needed seasons to be predictable. A story that tied the earth to the sky turned weather from a random force into something humans could approach. If there was a bridge, maybe a brave or clever person could cross it and bargain for what the village needed. At the same time, many cultures shaped figures who stood in the way of that crossing. Giants, ogres, and man-eaters are not just big villains. They are obstacles personified. They hold on to food, daylight, animals, or precious objects that humans need. In many ancient tales, a hero frees those goods by tricking or out-wrestling the giant. The victory is not merely personal. It brings a benefit back to the community. This pattern appears again and again because it expresses a shared problem. Food runs short. The harvest fails. The world seems unfair. So the story imagines someone small who challenges someone very large and returns with what was kept from ordinary people. That is the ancient template. Now add a plant. In Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe, beans were not just side dishes. They were staples, high in protein, storable, and hardy. They climb quickly, spiraling upward as if in a hurry to reach the light. For farmers who watched vines race toward the sun, the idea that a plant could create a path to the sky did not feel ridiculous. It felt like something plants already wanted to do. Over time, the image of a ladder and the reality of a climbing vine braided together. The beanstalk is a latecomer compared to the world tree, but when it arrives, it clicks neatly into the older design. A living ladder grows overnight. A hungry boy can ascend it. A realm above holds what the ground below is missing. Move forward to the islands of Britain and Ireland. Here, the figure later called Jack already had a long career in folk tradition. Jack is not a specific person. Jack is a role. He is the clever lad, the underdog, the one who blunders and yet wins. He shows up in dozens of English and Celtic tales as Jack the Giant Killer, Jack and his cunning, Jack and the animals. The name is ordinary for a reason. He is meant to be anyone. When you hear Jack, you are meant to think of your neighbor's boy, or your own child, or yourself as a child. That flexibility helps the story travel and change. A trickster can steal fire from a god. A farm boy can take a harp from a giant. The same function is at work. Folktale scholars group stories by their plot skeletons, and the skeleton for Jack and the Beanstalk fits into a family about a young hero who steals or wins treasures from a giant. In many versions, those treasures are 3 in number, which matters because 3 is a stable beat in oral storytelling. First, the hero steals one thing and escapes. Then he risks going back for the second and the third. Each attempt raises the stakes. The treasures also line up with basic needs. There is often a hen that lays golden eggs, which echoes the wish for a constant food source that never runs out. There is a self-playing harp or a musical instrument that brings joy or summons help, marking the return of ordered sound after chaos. There may be a bag of coins or a mill that grinds grain without end, which stands in for wealth and sustenance combined. The giant hoards these items. Jack brings them home. The pattern is not random. It channels the deep wish that scarcity can be solved by courage and wit. But how old is this pattern really? The idea that elements of the tale are thousands of years old rests on 2 kinds of evidence. One is linguistic and cultural comparison. When many branches of a language family share similar motifs with consistent functions, like the sky bridge and the giant hoarder, it suggests the seed existed before the branches split. Another clue is geographic spread. The boy and ogre cycle appears from Ireland across northern Europe and into parts of the Balkans and beyond. Variants do not match word for word, but they share bones. That level of distribution takes many generations of telling. It does not prove an exact date, but it shows a long past. There is also a practical reason ancient people clung to this tale pattern. Societies on the edge of hunger cannot afford purely decorative stories. A plot survives because it does work. The work this plot does is to model risk. When is it right to steal from a powerful oppressor? What counts as justified boldness rather than reckless greed? The hero's climb dramatizes that ethical problem. By testing the line and returning alive, he maps a path for others. That is why the story has force even before it picks up names like Jack, before it meets a printed page, before cities or schools get involved. It is a human tool for thinking through danger. For a very long time, tales like this moved by memory alone. In a world without cheap books, stories traveled with people who walked, sailed, and traded. Think of itinerant workers, tinkers, shepherds, and sailors swapping episodes around fires or at fairs. In that kind of oral network, stories do not stay fixed. A teller reshapes details to suit the moment and the audience. Weather and famine years can shift a villain's image. A local lord's cruelty can color the giant's behavior. A community's code can change whether the hero's theft is framed as sin or rescue. Yet through all that change, the core remains because it keeps paying off. Children lean in when they hear about the magic beans. Adults nod at the victory over a bully. The ending gives permission to cheer for an underdog who brings back what the village needs. At some point, the beanstalk image fused with the giant theft cycle in England. Beans were common in English fields and kitchens. A handful of beans could seem worthless or priceless depending on the season. They also connect the story to risk at the household level. Selling the cow is a family disaster. Trading it for beans is a worse one, until the trade opens a path to abundance. That switch from apparent foolishness to unexpected gain is exactly how many folk plots earn attention. It is memorable, and it teaches a soft lesson about not judging a gift too quickly. The English and Celtic giant lore also helped. In Cornwall and Wales and across the north, landscapes are dotted with hills, tors, and standing stones linked to giant legends. People told of huge figures who threw boulders or straddled rivers, who built causeways from island to island. That background made it easy to place a giant's home in the clouds above and to give him a taste for human flesh. The giant became a figure who is both supernatural and local. He is the storm that damages crops and the cruel landlord rolled into one. By the time storytellers in England were shaping what we would recognize as Jack and the Beanstalk, the tale had picked up a moral undertone that is older than church sermons. It is the idea that luck helps those who dare, The beans are a risk, the climb is a risk, sneaking around the castle is a risk. Each gamble could ruin the boy and his mother. But the story grants that sometimes only a gamble can break a cycle of poverty. That is not advice to be reckless in real life. It is an imaginative training drill. It gives listeners a rehearsal for the moment when they may have to choose movement over fear. If the tale is so old, why do we not have early written versions? The answer is simple. Most communities did not write down children's stories, and when they did, the paper did not always survive. Writing was expensive. Scribes focused on laws, scripture, chronicles, and elite poetry. Oral tales changed with each telling and did not sit easily on the page. Only when printing got cheap and popular did collectors and publishers decide to trap a moving story in ink. That would come later. Before that, for centuries upon centuries, the tale lived in mouths and ears, carried by people who might never see their names in any book. It matters that the tale is not the work of a single author. Because there is no owner, the community feels free to edit. A merchant can tell it one way at a fair. A grandmother can tell it another way by the hearth, and a traveling storyteller can add a twist heard 2 counties away. Each adds their own pressure. Over time, the version that best fits the needs of a region and era rises to the top. That is how certain details stick. The giant's chant warning that he smells human blood, the counting of gold, the self-playing harp that cries out at the right moment. They are efficient devices that work on listeners, so they remain. There is another reason the beanstalk took hold. It solves a plotting problem that the older world tree image could not. A cosmic ash is majestic, but it belongs to gods and monsters. A bean vine is scrappy and domestic. It can sprout in a cottage garden. It can be planted by a child. That makes the bridge to the sky personal and immediate. You can plant your own chance to climb. The image drew power from everyday life, and therefore had more chances to be told and retold in kitchens and fields, not just in sacred spaces. So when did all this begin? If you look for a calendar date, you will be frustrated, because oral stories rarely leave footprints on exact days. But if you look at the age of the elements, you can place them. The world tree and the sky bridge belong to deep time, well before classical antiquity, forming among peoples who watch the stars as part of survival. The boy against giant theme runs through early European myth cycles and sagas and persists across the Middle Ages. Beans have been part of European farming since long before written English existed. By the time these threads meet in England, the groundwork has been laid for centuries upon centuries. The finished weave would not be pinned down in print until much later, but the loom was already humming. Why is this background important? Because it shows that Jack and the Beanstalk is not a strange outlier. It is a local expression of a very old human habit, telling ourselves that courage can climb, that power can be outwitted, and that the fruits of the sky can be brought down for those on the ground. When you understand that, you can see why the tale has staying power. It offers a way to think about scarcity and fairness without naming specific kings or laws. It speaks to children and adults at the same time. It gives comfort and provocation in one package. And it travels well because its parts are basic and portable. The story's turning point came when it left the glow of a hearth and entered ink, price, and opinion. Once printers could sell short booklets cheaply, they did what markets always do. They tidied, amplified, and argued with what people already loved. In London, a version about a boy, some beans, and a giant began to appear under titles that sound both familiar and slightly off, like a name heard through a doorway. The plot was there, the trade, the climb, the thefts, the chase. But now each choice could be fixed on paper, and fixing it raised a problem that oral storytelling had kept flexible. Was the boy a hero or a thief? That simple question became the main conflict of the printed tale. Chapbook publishers needed buyers among parents, teachers, and clergy, as well as children. Those gatekeepers often wanted more than thrills. They wanted a reason to cheer for the boy beyond the pleasure of seeing him outwit a bully. So the earliest printed versions experimented with motives. Some left the boy's need and courage to speak for themselves. Others tried out new backstory. The giant had wronged the boy's family first. The treasures were stolen goods. The climb was not mere greed, but justice. Once that seed was planted, later writers would water it heavily. By the early 19th century, London booksellers were producing neat little volumes aimed at young readers. One publisher put out a version that leaned hard into moral cause and effect. In this telling, the giant had murdered the boy's father and seized property. The beans came from a mysterious figure who knew the truth. The climb was a test, not a prank, and each treasure recovered was rightfully the boy's inheritance. The decision to add this frame did not come out of nowhere. It answered the taste of the day. Middle-class readers in that era looked for stories that taught clear lessons. If a child stole, there had better be a serious reason and a social payoff. This change mattered because it pushed the Beanstalk tale from a trickster caper toward a drama about rightful redress. It also set off a debate that would shape later printings. How much should editors justify old folk plots to match current values? A scholar and collector at the end of the 19th century would push the pendulum back. He argued that English tales did not need to be scrubbed into sermons, and that the old backbone of the story could stand on its own. Yet even he kept a faint trace of the moral claim, as if afraid to abandon it entirely. The printed page made such hedging visible. What the traveling teller could shade with voice and gesture, the book had to commit to in sentences. While editors wrestled with motive, another new force entered the story's life: illustration. Woodcuts and later engravings taught readers how to picture the giant, the vine, the castle, and the chase. Pictures do not leave much room for ambiguity. When artists drew the giant as a grotesque predator, the boy's actions looked braver and cleaner. When artists emphasized the giant's wealth and indifference to human suffering, the thefts felt like rescue missions. Drawings also clarified the sequence that oral versions had left flexible. First the coins, then the hen, then the harp. 3 raids, 3 escapes, a swelling danger, a final cut of the axe. The rhythm of 3, easy to remember when spoken, became expected when printed and pictured. Printing also changed the setting of the boy's home life. Oral tellers could hint at poverty with a gesture or a line about an empty cupboard. On the page, writers spelled it out. A widowed mother, a failing farm, debts pressing at the door. These details built pressure under the decision to trade the cow for beans. The stakes rose, and with them, the reader's sympathy. The boy was no longer just a lively kid chasing wonder. He was someone with a household on his shoulders making a desperate bet. That sharpened the story's logic. Risk taken in extremity feels different from risk taken for fun. Out of these choices, the core chase scene also toughened. Oral versions often let the boy scamper down in a blur, with the giant bellowing above. Printed versions slowed the moment, turning it into a set piece. The giant wakes, the floor shakes, the harp cries out for help, footsteps pound, clouds split, the vine sways, the axe bites, and the fall resolves everything in a crash. On the page, this sequence could build with measured sentences until the cut. That sense of escalation, trouble getting heavier with each raid, is one of the biggest developments the press added. The climb became not just vertical, but cumulative, a staircase of risk. As the century turned and public schools spread, the tale slid into readers and anthologies across the English-speaking world. Editors made more decisions. Some favored brisk, almost newspaper-like prose. Others kept scraps of dialect and chant, like the giant's famous sniffing line, because such phrases were already part of public memory. That line is a good example of how print can carry sound. Once it was on a page, children could learn it and recite it back, and the chant echoed from home to home with far less drift than in pure oral culture. The biggest cultural current touching the story in those years was a shift in what adults thought children's books were for. Earlier in the 19th century, many writers used stories mostly to warn and shape. By the later decades, a countercurrent held that children deserved real wonder and adventure, not just morals in costume. The Beanstalk tale sat right on the boundary of these views. It had fear and daring. It also had a tidy ending in which a household is saved and a threat to the community is removed. Collections that prized sheer imagination kept the vivid climb and chase. Collections that prized character building kept the motive of recovery and the final lesson that clever courage, used for good, could lift a family from ruin. While the English tradition was doing this work, scholars in Europe were building systems to sort and compare folk plots. They gave the boy and ogre cycle a number and filed variants from many languages under it. That filing did not change the story for ordinary readers, but it did change how editors thought about it. Knowing that similar plots turned up from Ireland to the Balkans and beyond made English adapters a little bolder about stripping away heavy moral frames that had only local appeal. It also encouraged the reuse of certain plot bones that showed up again and again in other countries. The three thefts, the cry of the magic object that betrays the hero, the final severing of the path between worlds. The 20th century added two more engines, cinema and mass-market publishing. Animators and filmmakers loved the clear stakes and cartoon-ready contrast between tiny hero and hulking villain. A mid-century animated featurette put a cheerful farm boy in the role and softened the violence without removing it. Audiences watched a beanstalk burst through a house, a giant stride across clouds, and an axe swipe that sent the villain tumbling. This screen version fixed for millions the look and feel of the climb. It also nudged the tone toward humor and away from dread, a choice that later picture books echoed. At the same time, printed retellings split. Some went lighter and sillier, casting the boy as a chatterbox and the giant as more bluster than bite. Others went darker or slyer, offering endings in which the boy faces consequences or the giant is given a voice. A handful of modern poets reshaped the tale into sharp, subversive verse, asking who gets to call theft just when the thief is charming. Those twists did not erase the classic form, but they kept it from fossilizing. The beanstalk could be fun, frightening, or pointed, depending on the teller's aim. One underappreciated development was the growing attention to the mother. In oral tellings, she is often a scold, a voice of caution who throws the beans out the window. In many printed versions, writers gave her clearer reasons and sharper lines, turning the family's situation into a moral weight. When she warns the boy, she is not simply squashing curiosity, she is calculating risk in a world with no safety net. That change added friction to the early scenes and made the boy's disobedience feel more complicated. The audience now had to weigh two kinds of courage: the courage to leap and the courage to hold the line. Class and property also came to the surface more plainly in print. Oral tales could gesture widely at power without naming it. Books, especially in industrial cities, were read by families living under landlords and bosses they could point to. The giant's hoard looked like hoarded capital. The boy's raids looked like clawing back what had been squeezed from the poor. Not every version leaned into this view, but enough did that readers could feel it even when it was not spelled out. The pursuit down the vine was a literal chase and a metaphor for a class fight. Escalation in the plot matched escalation in the world outside the book. Another decision point concerned magic itself. Some printed versions made the beans the gift of a fairy or wise woman, tying the story to a wider network of helpful supernatural figures. Others kept the traitor nameless and let the beans be simply unusual, as if wonder could erupt from the ordinary. The first approach anchors the plot in a moral economy. Higher powers test and reward the worthy. The second approach keeps the door open for chance and human agency. Both create different flavors of responsibility when the moment of theft arrives. Editors also had to decide how much of the giant's world to show. Oral tellers could leave the cloudland vague and misty. Artists and authors began to draw kitchens, cages, counting rooms, and halls. Each detail changed the feel of the thefts. A kitchen with bones on the floor pushed the giant toward cannibal horror and made the boy's actions feel more like rescue. A counting room stacked with coins pushed the giant toward miserly tyranny and made the thefts feel like revolt. These choices were not neutral. They taught readers how to feel about the climb. By the time scholars in the early and mid-20th century studied thousands of variants, they noticed a steady drift in English printings. The boy's motive kept being clarified. In the oldest printed forms, he might be curious, hungry, or foolhardy. By the High Victorian era, he was an avenger. By mid-century retellings for schools, he was often a problem solver acting for his mother's sake. Late-century versions sometimes swung back toward ambiguity, inviting readers to decide whether boldness tipped into theft. That oscillation is the clearest sign of the story's living core. Each generation adjusts the dial to match what it wants to teach about power and property. One more technical shift altered the way readers experienced escalation. Serialized magazines and graded readers broke the tale into chapters or levels. Instead of hearing the whole arc in one sitting, children met the first raid on one day, the second on another, the third a week later. This pacing stretched tension and turned the Beanstalk into a ladder of cliffhangers. Teachers liked the built-in repetition and rising stakes because it trained attention and prediction. Children liked it because the promise of a next daring climb is hard to resist. When people retell the climb, they are not only sharing a thrilling plot, they are working with a bundle of symbols that speak to hunger, hope, and the risk of crossing limits. The Beanstalk is the most obvious symbol. It grows fast, it ignores fences, and it points straight up. In many cultures, a vertical path is a way to imagine contact with what seems beyond reach, whether that is the weather, the gods, or the future. In this story, the path is not a sacred mountain reserved for priests or kings. It is a plant in a poor family's yard. That detail matters. It says that access to change can grow from the most ordinary ground. The magic is not in a royal palace, but in a handful of seeds. The climb also looks like a map of social mobility. A poor household is stuck at one level, blocked by scarcity and by someone who hoards more than he needs. The ascent is an attempt to move up a system that keeps most people down. The boy's quick trips into the cloud world and his even faster exits echo how the powerless often have to navigate the powerful, in bursts, with care, and with an exit plan. The final cut of the vine is not only a safety move, it is a symbolic closing of a dangerous route that served its purpose. Once the giant falls, the path between classes is severed because the thread it carried no longer needs to be climbed past. The giant himself collects several meanings. He is a keeper of resources who uses fear to stay in control. He lives above the weather line, in a place without want. He does not share. He eats smaller beings. He smells human blood as if any visitor is a crime. Many readers see him as a picture of monopolized wealth. Others see him as a raw force of nature that must be bounded. Neither reading requires a leap. The story gives us a figure who is both a person and a system. He can be defeated in a single fight, and yet he also stands for pressures a village faces year after year. That combination is one reason the character keeps returning in culture. It lets a local storyteller talk about power without naming a neighbor. The stolen objects carry meaning beyond their sparkle. A hen that lays golden eggs points to steady supply. Gold shines, but the deeper point is regular yield. A bag of coins or a self-filling mill stands for stored food and credit, the things that keep a household from collapse when times are lean. A self-playing harp is joy under its own power. It also gathers people. Music organizes a room. When the harp cries out during the last raid, it does what community does when someone crosses a line. It raises an alarm. Symbolically, the treasures are not luxuries. They are the foundation stones of a decent life, food, capital, and culture. Bringing them home is not only a win for one boy, it is a repair of what the giant's hoarding broke. The mother, though not the climber, is part of the symbolic frame. She voices caution, the logic of survival. Her worry is not cowardice, it is the knowledge that a single bad gamble can ruin a family. Her presence keeps the story from glamorizing risk for its own sake. The boy's boldness is measured against a real cost. In that way, the tale keeps two truths in play at once. It says courage is needed, and it says care is needed. Pitched to children, the story gives both a jolt and a break, which is why parents and teachers have kept it in rotation even as values shift. Many cultures hold stories about a path to the sky and a keeper who must be outwitted. These are not the same tale in disguise, and it would be wrong to weld them together, but the likeness of their parts helps explain why the Beanstalk story resonates. Some Native American traditions speak of a tree or a vine used to travel between worlds, and of a cut that breaks that travel when balance is lost. Several West African folktales remember a time when the sky sat closer to the earth and people could pass food up by rope until a breach of manners forced the sky to pull away. In parts of Melanesia, there are stories of a climbing plant or a web that reaches heaven and is severed after a theft. Far to the north, Siberian shamanic accounts describe climbing a tree to petition spirits for health or weather. These accounts come from different histories and needs, yet they share a practical idea. Vital goods are controlled by someone or something above, and humans will try many means, request, trickery, or bravery to win a share. Cross-cultural comparisons also clarify the moral puzzle at the center. In Greek myth, a titan steals fire for humankind and pays a heavy price. In some Polynesian stories, a culture hero fishes up resources or lengthens the day by daring to snare the sun. In those cases, the theft or struggle is framed as a gift to everyone. In the Beanstalk story, the framing has changed over time, but the social function is similar. The boy's raids are not only for personal gain in most printings, they stabilize a household and remove a predator. This shift in framing is why the tale can move between eras with different ideas about property. A version that leans into justice speaks to readers worried about inequality. A version that leans into wonder speaks to readers hungry for courage and luck. The climb has also been read as a simple map of growing up. Many rites of passage around the world include an ascent, a test in a hard place, and a return with proof. In this view, the beans are a first teenaged bargain, the cloudland is a risky adult sphere, the treasures are skills, and the cut vine is a break from childish dependence. This reading does not cancel social readings, it runs alongside them. The story seems to invite layered meanings because it is built from layered needs: hunger for food, hunger for fairness, and hunger for identity. Education has used these layers for practical ends. Teachers across the 20th century have treated the story as a tool for thinking out loud about moral choice. They ask students to argue whether the boy was right to take the treasures, what rules a community should have about property, and how fear and need shape choices. The giant's chant is used to practice phonics and performance. The 3 raids set up prediction exercises and discussions about risk. In this way, the symbols are not only interpreted, they are converted into classroom practice. The tale influences how children learn to debate, to sense rising tension, and to hold 2 ideas together. Popular culture has borrowed the symbols for quick communication. A poster that shows a beanstalk piercing a roof sells the feeling of sudden opportunity. A headline about a startup climbing the beanstalk signals bold growth from humble beginnings. The phrase fee-fi-fo-fum can, for better or worse, label any blunt, stomping force. Advertising often flattens complex stories, but the fact that these images work at a glance proves how deeply the symbols have sunk into shared memory. They do not need explanation to do their job. Writers and filmmakers have used the symbols to ask harder questions too. Modern retellings sometimes shift the viewpoint to servants trapped in the castle, or to a giant who is tired rather than cruel, to test whether might itself is the problem or its misuse. Others move the action to cities and swap the vine for an elevator or a stairwell, making class movement explicit. Some poets lay the beanstalk over migration stories, seeing the climb as a border crossing. Again, not all of these read the ancient core the same way, but they prove that the core is sturdy enough to carry new weight. There is also a psychological reading that has stayed close to mainstream scholarship. In that view, the beanstalk is impulse, the sudden growth of a wish that seems foolish to adults, but turns out to open a path. The giant is appetite at its worst, a devouring hunger that never gives. The treasures are self-control and creativity. Cutting the vine is the act of limiting one's own impulses after getting what was needed. This reading does not require belief in hidden messages planted by a specific author. It rounds up what many readers already feel, that the tale puts names and shapes on urges, fears, and limits that children and adults recognize in themselves. Another way to see the story's impact is through what it has made possible. Because the plot is so well known, artists can spin against it and trust the audience to follow. A version that keeps the vine but removes the theft makes a strong point about consent and sharing. A version that keeps the theft but removes the giant asks harder questions about who counts as a victim. A version that lets the vine keep growing after the cut plays with the idea that paths to the sky are hard to close once opened. Each twist uses the same tools to do new work. Even the language of seeds and growth has reached into public speech. Leaders talk about planting beans when they mean small, risky investments that might shoot up. Activists talk about cutting the vine when they mean ending a harmful channel that once had a use. The story's garden imagery gives a human scale to abstract debates. It anchors arguments about policy and power in a shared metaphor that most people can picture. Cross-cultural echoes continue to keep the images fresh. In East Asian lore, a hero may climb a mountain or a rope to reach a heavenly court and bargain for rain. In parts of South Asia, there are legends of a tree that connects worlds and of demons who hoard the waters until a clever figure frees them. These are not proofs of a single source. They are reminders that human groups in many places have told stories that turn vertical distance into a stage for courage. The beanstalk tale sits among them as one local expression that has become unusually portable through print and screen. The influence also flows backward, shaping how people read older myths. Once you have grown up with a boy on a vine, you notice a shared pulse when you meet a hero who climbs a cosmic tree, steals a guarded tool, or returns with a gift that changes the village. The result is not confusion, but a kind of learning. Readers start to see that stories talk to one another across gaps of time and place. That awareness enriches both the children's tale and the ancient ones, because each helps decode the other's signals. It is worth stressing what the symbols do not say. The tale does not give a blank check to theft. It does not claim that any strong desire makes a good deed. Its power lies in how it pins its action to need, to unfair hoarding, and to risks taken with others in mind. That is why the story keeps feeling timely without being tied to one era's laws. It asks a question that every generation faces. When can the small and the hungry challenge the big and the full? And what should happen next? Seen as a whole, the beanstalk story endures because its symbols are simple enough for a child to grasp and deep enough for an adult to debate. A vine, a climb, a castle, a cut. Each piece carries work far bigger than its size. The tale gives a language for power and passage, for the mix of daring and caution that most lives require. It also gives a ritual of return, leave, confront, take, and come home with tools that make life more livable. In that ritual, people across cultures recognize themselves, which is why the climb continues. The boy, the vine, and the giant keep returning because they solve a human puzzle in plain shapes. A path appears where none should exist. A gatekeeper falls to wit and grit. What was hoarded flows again. Across many cultures and many eras, people have used these same moves to think about hunger, fairness, and growth. That is the quiet power of this old story. It turns the hardest questions into steps most of us can climb. In the end, the secret is not only that the tale is old, it is that the tale is useful, and as long as those uses remain, the beanstalk will keep rising in new soil,